There's something you see when you close your eyes, and nobody's ever really explained what the hell it means. It ain't your imagination. It ain't just being tired. And it sure as hell isn't something mainstream science can touch. Because what goes down in that dark space, in that quiet between the outer world and your inner one, that's exactly what Jesus was getting at when he talked about Gnosis. That deep, living knowledge that doesn't come from any textbook, no sermon, no human institution, period. And listen, this ain't another one of those generic spiritual videos full of pretty words and no damn substance. What you're going to see here is something deliberately yanked from the scriptures, buried deep from popular teachings, and that survived for centuries only in the hands of folks who knew where to dig. We're talking about knowledge that got hunted, burned right along with entire manuscripts, and now it's resurfacing because people are finally starting to see, literally see, signals they just can't brush off anymore. Ever closed your eyes and seen geometric shapes shifting, lights pulsing out of nowhere, a spiral that feels like it's pulling you in, or maybe just a golden glow that pops up without you even trying? If you're nodding your head right now, you gotta understand, this ain't random. This ain't basic neurology. This is a sign. And Jesus knew this sign long before any neuroscientist ever slapped an electrode on someone's skull. The real tragedy? They taught you to ignore the very damn thing that should be the heart of your whole spiritual journey. They told you these visions are just nervous system static, phosphenes, eye strain, purely physical stuff with no deeper meaning. And while you bought that, while you dismissed these experiences like they were neurological junk, you were tossing out the oldest language there, is the language light uses to talk directly to your consciousness. Because there's something almost nobody picks up on, a detail so damn fundamental it completely flips how you understand Jesus' teachings, what Gnosis is, and what's happening to you right now. That detail is in the text that got cut from the biblical canon. It's in the Gospel of Thomas. It's in the Gospel of Philip. It's in the secret book of John. And it's even, in a veiled way, in the Gospels you already know, for those with eyes to see. The question you gotta ask isn't whether these visions are real. The question is, are you ready to get what they're trying to tell you? Because by the end of this video, something's gonna shift in how you see yourself, how you grasp spirituality, and, more than that, how you understand the purpose of these experiences you've been writing off as nothing. Stick with it. What's coming next is exactly what you've needed to hear for a damn long time. Think about it for a second. Your whole life, someone taught you to look for God out there, in churches, in rituals, in other people's words. But what if the path was always inward? What if what you see when you close your eyes was the very damn door Jesus called the kingdom within you? It ain't a metaphor. It ain't spiritual poetry. It's a map. And today, you're going to learn how to read that map. This video exists because thousands of people are reporting the same experiences and finding no real answers anywhere. Folks who meditate, who pray, who seek, and who are starting to realize something's shifting inside them. A consciousness that's expanding. A gut feeling that there's a hell of a lot more than what physical eyes can pick up. If you've ever felt like there's something nobody's telling you, something bigger, deeper, truer than anything they ever taught you, go ahead and hit that like button now. That simple move says you're ready to hear what's next. Subscribe to the channel too, because what we're going to keep digging into here goes way beyond this video. And drop a comment below with the word Gnos if you've had any of these experiences when you close your eyes. I really want to know how many folks are going through this awakening right now. To get what's happening to you, we got to roll back to a time way before what most folks peg as the start of Christianity. We got to go back to a context where the word gnosis wasn't some religious term, it was an experience. A direct, gut-level, transforming experience that didn't need middlemen, priests, or institutions. The word gnosis comes from ancient Greek and literally means knowledge, but not the kind you get from reading a textbook or sitting in a lecture. It's knowledge that sparks from inside. A recognition. Like you've known something for a damn long time and you're finally just remembering it. In the Mediterranean world of the 1st century AD, where Jesus' teachings started making the rounds, there were groups of people deep into this kind of inner knowledge. They were called Gnostics, and that word, which today sounds exotic, arcane, almost forbidden, simply meant someone who was after a direct experience of the divine, not blind faith, not obedience to dogma. The experience, the contact, the awakening. These groups flourished in the early centuries of the Christian era, especially between the 1st and 4th centuries. They cranked out sacred texts, developed contemplative practices, and held a view of the cosmos and human consciousness that was radically different from what would later become institutionalized Christianity. To them, a human being wasn't just some sinful creature waiting for judgment. They were a divine spark, a flicker of primordial light, temporarily trapped in matter and trying to recognize itself. Wake up, break free. And here's where it gets interesting, because the vast majority of Gnostic texts that survived, and a hell of a lot of them got destroyed, describe with unnerving precision experiences that happen in altered states of consciousness. Deep meditation, contemplative prayer, states that today neuroscience is starting to map, and that generations of spiritual seekers recognized as portals to a deeper reality. The texts talk about inner light, geometric visions, a feeling of consciousness expanding, encountering a luminous presence that has no defined form but communicates a wisdom that just can't be put into words. Sound familiar? It should, because it's exactly what folks all over the world describe when they practice deep meditation, contemplation, or simply when they close their eyes in silence and pay attention to what shows up in their inner visual field. In 1945, in Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi, a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near a rock when his hoe hit something hard. It was a sealed clay jar. Inside it were 13 papyrus codices, bound manuscripts containing over 50 Gnostic texts, written in Coptic, dating from the 4th century, but likely translations of much older Greek originals. This find was the spiritual equivalent of unearthing a buried treasure that many believed had been completely wiped out. Among those texts was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus that doesn't show up in the New Testament. There was the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and every one of those texts brought a vision of Jesus and his teachings that was profoundly different from the version that reached us through the official canon, a vision where self-knowledge and direct experience of the divine were central, where the awakening of consciousness was the very heart of the message. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the first sayings attributed to Jesus goes like this: "If those who lead you say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. But the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that you are the sons of the living Father." Read that again, real close. The kingdom is within you. Self-knowledge is the path. Direct experience of the divine is the goal. This ain't Buddhism, it ain't Hinduism, it ain't some imported Eastern philosophy. This is attributed to Jesus, and it's being said in a way that resonates with everything contemplative traditions worldwide have identified as the road to experiencing the sacred. Now, why does this matter to you? Why does it matter right now, in this moment, while you're sitting here watching this video? Because if the kingdom is inside you, and if there are inner experiences, like those visions you get when you close your eyes, that are mapped in spiritual traditions as signs of this awakening, then you ain't living through some random phenomenon. You're on the edge of something much bigger. And the next step is to understand what these experiences really mean within this Gnostic context we're just starting to lay bare together. There's a passage almost nobody brings up when they talk about Jesus' teachings. A passage that, when you grasp the context it was written in, completely changes how you interpret the whole damn spiritual journey. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 34, Jesus says something most people just gloss over without realizing the weight of what's being said. He states, "The lamp of your body is your eye. When your eye is pure, your whole body is luminous. But when your eye is evil, your body also is dark." In the Gnostic tradition, that eye ain't the physical one. It's what contemplatives call the inner eye, the eye of the soul. The organ of spiritual perception that sits beyond the physical senses and can perceive realities the eyes of the flesh just can't grasp. And when Jesus says that when this eye is pure, the whole body becomes luminous, he's talking about a state of consciousness, a state of awakening where inner perception is so clear, so wide open, that reality itself starts to reveal itself in a whole damn new way. Jewish Kabbalists, who preserved a lot of the esoteric knowledge of the Hebrew tradition, had a deep understanding that this primordial light didn't just vanish when the world was created. It went into hiding, stayed hidden from those who didn't have eyes to see. But it could be accessed through contemplative practices that cultivated the purity of the inner eye Jesus spoke of. And when that light started showing up in the seeker's inner experience, it was understood as a sign that the soul was remembering its divine origin. Now picture the impact of that. If the visions of light you experience when you close your eyes, those golden pulses, those brilliant geometric shapes, that feeling of a luminous presence that has no defined form but communicates a wisdom that can't be put into words, if these experiences are connected to a spiritual tradition thousands of years deep, one that includes Jesus' teachings in their most original, unfiltered form, then you ain't having some minor league experience. You're tapping into something the greatest seekers in human history identified as the most reliable sign of genuine spiritual awakening. And there's more, because modern neuroscience, without even meaning to, has started to back up what the Gnostics knew 2,000 years ago. Studies on deep meditation show that when the brain goes into states of high coherence, states where different brain regions start working in unusual harmony, people consistently report experiences of inner light, expanded consciousness, a feeling of connection to something much bigger than the individual self. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg from Thomas Jefferson University spent decades studying what happens in the brain during intense spiritual experiences. And what he found was that these states have a very specific neurological signature, a reduction of activity in the parietal lobe, which is the area responsible for perceiving body and self-boundaries, combined with an increase in activity in areas associated with a sense of presence and profound meaning. In other words, when you close your eyes and start seeing those lights, shapes, and patterns, your brain might be hitting exactly the kind of state that spiritual contemplatives from all traditions identified as the portal to the experience of the sacred. This doesn't dumb down the experience to mere neurology. It suggests that neurology is the dam mechanism by which a reality that transcends neurology starts to become accessible. But why is this happening now? Why are more and more people reporting these experiences? Why is the interest in Gnosis, in contemplative spirituality, in altered states of consciousness, and in esoteric traditions accelerating at this point in history? That's the question that's going to lead us to the next point, and the answer is both simpler and deeper than you can even imagine. There's a truth about Gnosis most folks never hear, not because it's tough to get, but because it was deliberately scrubbed from pretty much everything you've ever learned about spirituality and Jesus' teachings. And when you hear it, you'll get why so many people who start having deep contemplative experiences feel like they're uncovering something they always knew, but just never had the words for. Gnosis ain't a belief. Never was. That's the first and most fundamental damn misunderstanding about it. When Jesus taught in the closest circles of his disciples, not to the crowds, but in those locked-down groups, in those moments of deep teaching the Gospels call secret teachings, he wasn't asking people to buy into a doctrine. He was passing on a methodology. A way to wake up inner perception that allowed a human being to directly experience divine reality without needing any middlemen. In the Gospel of Thomas, saying number 3, Jesus drops something extraordinary. If those who lead you say, "The kingdom is in the sky," the birds of the sky will get there first. If they say, "It is in the sea," the fish will get there first. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. The one who knows himself will discover this. And when he discovers himself, he will understand that he is the Son of the living Father. What makes this even more impactful is that in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity and made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, there was a deliberate process of cherry-picking the texts that would make up the biblical canon. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and the processes that followed weren't just abstract theological debates. They were political decisions. Decisions about which teachings people would be allowed to access and which would be deemed heretical, forbidden, dangerous. And the main criterion that shoved the Gnostic texts out of the official canon was exactly this. They taught that a person could access the divine directly, without needing an ecclesiastical structure as a middleman. For an empire using religion as a tool for social cohesion and political control, that was a non-starter. A believer who has direct access to the sacred doesn't need a bishop to validate their experience, doesn't need a priest to mediate their relationship with God, doesn't need an institution to hold authority over their spirituality. So the texts preserving these teachings got destroyed. The groups practicing them were hunted down. People who had experiences of inner light and interpreted them as contact with the divine were labeled heretics. The Library of Alexandria, which held so much of this accumulated knowledge, was destroyed, not once, but 3 times over centuries, and each time it happened, a piece of humanity's spiritual memory got lost. But something survived. Always does. Knowledge that hits on truth finds ways to stick around, even when every damn person carrying it gets hunted. It survived in the Nag Hammadi texts, buried in the desert by monks who knew what they were hiding was too precious to be wiped out. It survived in the Sufi tradition of Islam, which preserved similar contemplative practices. It survived in the Jewish Kabbalah. It survived in the Christian mystical traditions of folks like Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Hildegard of Bingen, who described in their writings the exact same inner light experiences the Gnostics mapped out centuries earlier. And it survived in you, because the ability to have these experiences ain't learned. It's inherent. It's part of what it means to be human with a spiritual dimension awakened. And what you see when you close your eyes, whether it's a diffuse light, geometric patterns, pulsing colors, or a presence you feel more than see, All of that is part of a vocabulary the Gnostic tradition spent centuries trying to preserve so that you, today, right now, could have the language to understand what the hell is happening to you. The central revelation, then, is this. You ain't starting a journey. You're remembering one that began way before you can even imagine. Now I want to hit you with a direct question, and I want you to really think about it before we keep going. Have you ever had an experience, maybe during prayer, meditation, a moment of deep silence, or just before falling asleep, where something you saw when you closed your eyes left you with a gut feeling you touched something real, something bigger, something that didn't fit any rational explanation you knew? A light that seemed to have intelligence. A shape that felt like a message. A presence that seemed to say, without words, that you were more than you thought you were. If the answer is yes, and for a lot of folks here, it is, even if you've never talked about it with anyone, then what's happening to you is exactly what the Gnostic texts called the awakening of the divine spark. And that's an experience Jesus didn't just know about. It was the damn core of everything he taught in his most intimate circles. Thing is, when you start to get the real context of these teachings, the context that was systematically yanked from people's access for reasons we're going to dig into later in this video, certain experiences that once seemed isolated, confusing, or meaningless start to fall into a coherent pattern. And that pattern has practical, real, transformative implications for how you live, how you pray, how you meditate, and how you relate to the spiritual dimension of your existence. Just think about what we've covered so far. There's knowledge that was passed directly by Jesus to his closest disciples. That knowledge was preserved in texts hidden for centuries. And that same knowledge maps experiences you might be having, visions of light, geometric patterns, sensations of expansion, as signs of expansion pure, it's how appear, eskal onlikawagen, that are pure, via mozelax gate grill.
Jeter's better not insist. What's a side fanver?
Volvlaf, Brisnoz light. That's a thread connecting you to a tradition that's 2,000 years deep. If you've made it this far and something in this content is hitting home, resonating with a truth you've always felt deep down but never had the words for, I want you to drop a word in the comments right now. Type awakening below. I want to see how many of you are experiencing this recognition right now because that matters. You're not alone in this, and seeing those comments will show others who are searching that there's a whole community going through the same process. And look, this next part, this is where it gets really deep. Because up to now, we've laid out the historical and spiritual context. But in the upcoming sections, we're diving into what these experiences specifically mean, how to recognize different types of visions and what each might be communicating, and why there's a very specific reason this knowledge is resurfacing right now at this moment in history. Stick with me. For centuries, the most powerful evidence that Gnostic teachings represented a legitimate tradition, deeply rooted in the original teachings of Jesus, lay literally buried in the desert. But the discovery of Nag Hammadi in 1945 wasn't the only window history left open for us. Long before that, researchers, theologians, and philosophers brave enough to question the official narrative found clues in unexpected places in Paul's own letters, in the writings of early church fathers who tried to refute the Gnostics, and in doing so, ended up preserving precious fragments of the very teachings they aimed to destroy. Irenaeus of Lyon, a 2nd century Christian bishop who penned a lengthy treatise called Against Heresies, is a fascinating example of this. He dedicated 5 entire volumes to refuting the Gnostics, and in the process of trying to prove them wrong, he quoted, described, and summarized Gnostic teachings in such detail that his book paradoxically became one of our primary historical sources for what the Gnostics actually taught. It's like a censor trying to ban a book, inadvertently preserved its content for posterity by meticulously describing it. What Irenaeus described is consistent with what the Nag Hammadi texts revealed over 1,700 years later. 2nd century Gnostic groups taught that there exists within every human being a spark of divine light called pneuma, from the Greek for spirit or breath, which is imprisoned in matter but can awaken, recognize itself, and return to its source. And the path to this awakening wasn't about following external rules, but cultivating a specific inner perception. A perception that began precisely with recognizing the experiences of light that emerge when the mind quiets and the physical eyes close. Archaeological confirmation came from multiple sources. Beyond the Nag Hammadi texts, researchers found evidence of Gnostic contemplative practices in inscriptions, in paintings within early Christian catacombs, and in references within Second Temple period Jewish texts describing intense meditation practices known as Hekela, the traditions of the heavenly chambers. In these practices, the adept entered deep states of contemplation and sought to ascend through increasingly intense chambers of light, ultimately encountering a presence of absolute luminosity that the texts identified with the glory of God, the Shekinah. The similarity between what these traditions describe and what people worldwide report during deep meditations, near-death experiences, or simply in moments of intense contemplative prayer is so consistent that researchers like Karen Armstrong, Elaine Pagels, and Gilles Quispel have dedicated decades of rigorous academic work to documenting these convergences. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, who spent her career studying the Nag Hammadi texts, concluded in her research that these texts represent a genuine early Christian tradition, not an import of pagan philosophy, but a line of teaching that dates back to Jesus' own inner circle. And here's a piece of evidence many people aren't aware of. The Gospel of John, found in the canonical New Testament, contains passages that scholars identify as having roots in the very same contemplative tradition that the Gnostic texts represent. When John writes that the light came into the world, and the darkness did not comprehend it, he's using language that directly resonates with the Gnostic cosmology of primordial light imprisoned in matter. When John's prologue describes the Logos, the Word, as the light that illuminates every human being who comes into the world, he's articulating precisely the Gnostic concept of the divine spark present in each person. This has enormous implications, because it means the contemplative and Gnostic tradition wasn't some external thing that tried to infiltrate Christianity. It was part of the original core. It was one of the threads woven into the fabric of the earliest teachings. And when you start to see with this new pair of eyes, the pair of eyes that Gnosis promises to open, the very scriptures you already know begin to reveal layers of meaning that were there all along, just waiting to be perceived. The question that remains is, why do so few people know about this? Why are this context, these pieces of evidence, these texts, these convergences between spiritual tradition and direct human experience so rarely mentioned? The answer to that question is what makes this story not just intellectually fascinating, but personally urgent, and we're about to dive into it. What was done with Gnostic knowledge over the past 17 centuries is one of the most deliberate stories of intellectual and spiritual suppression humanity has ever lived through. And when you grasp the scale of what was erased, you start to understand why most people have never heard about Gnosis, about inner light experiences, about Jesus' teachings that aren't in the four canonical Gospels, and why, when these things do surface, they tend to be immediately dismissed as heresy, paganism, or just plain madness. The persecution of the Gnostics wasn't an isolated event. It was a systematic campaign that lasted for centuries. Starting in the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, Gnostic groups were gradually marginalized and then actively persecuted. Their texts were declared heretical and ordered destroyed. Their practices were forbidden. Their leaders were exiled or executed. What made the Gnostics particularly threatening to the institutional church then forming was precisely what made them so compelling. They didn't need the church. For a Gnostic, the supreme spiritual authority was direct inner experience Gnosis. It wasn't the bishop. It wasn't the priest. It wasn't the sacred text interpreted by a hierarchy. It was the divine spark within each person, awakening and recognizing itself. This rendered any external power structure fundamentally superfluous to spiritual life. And in a world where the church was building one of the greatest systems of institutional power history had ever seen, that idea was explosive. The Council of Nicaea in 325 established Christian orthodoxy in a way that explicitly excluded contemplative and Gnostic traditions, but subsequent councils went even further. The Council of Laodicea, around 363, produced a list of books that could be read in churches, and anything left off that list was, in practice, condemned. The Synod of Carthage in 397 consolidated the canon in a way that remains to this day. But the persecution didn't stop with texts. In 391, Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria led a mob in an attack on the Serapeum, the temple housing the largest remaining portion of the Library of Alexandria at that time. Priceless manuscripts were destroyed. In 415, the philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria, who was one of the last representatives of the philosophical and contemplative tradition to have survived until then, was brutally murdered by a Christian mob at the behest of Bishop Cyril. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Cathars, a spiritual movement in southern France that preserved significant elements of the Gnostic tradition, including contemplative practices and a cosmology of light very similar to that of the early Gnostics, were destroyed by the Albigensian Crusade, ordered by Pope Innocent III. It's estimated that between 20,000 and 1 million people were massacred. The city of Béziers was completely annihilated. When one of the Crusades' commanders asked the papal representative how to distinguish heretics from Catholics during the massacre, the reply attributed to the papal legate Arnaud Amaric was, Kill them all. God will know his own. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And it tells us something really important about the nature of the knowledge that was being suppressed. It was dangerous enough that powerful people felt it necessary to kill to prevent its spread. A harmless, irrelevant, unsubstantial teaching doesn't inspire that level of organized violence. The scale of the persecution is, paradoxically, one of the best pieces of evidence that what was being destroyed was genuinely transformative. Today, suppression doesn't need bonfires. It works through silence, through omission in theological curricula, through academic ridicule, through a culture that associates deep contemplative experiences with mental disorders instead of recognizing them as what millennia of spiritual tradition identified as the most direct path to genuine self-knowledge. But something's shifting. And the reason you're here, listening to this, feeling this resonance, is part of that shift. A shift that goes beyond what it seems like at first glance. When we look at the history of human spirituality with intellectual honesty, something becomes impossible to ignore. In completely different traditions, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, there's a remarkable convergence of descriptions about what happens when a human being genuinely deepens into contemplative practice. Islamic Sufis speak of Nur, the divine light that the mystic's heart begins to perceive. Tibetan Buddhists describe Rigpa, the pure awareness that manifests as clear light during deep meditation and at the moment of death. Hindu Vedantists speak of Jyotir Brahman, the luminous Brahman, the ultimate reality perceived as pure light. Jewish Kabbalists describe the Or Ein Sof. And Christian Yushnes a direction of Pablovinachand and Wine Eavis and the full defineloiwazimus and deismov. Haibuti formatal of all I brain out churchu. So will Haiwatashin Tirov to Druwebi Tirums, which is for Lema and Jorna Pampan, and Tioner Mels, that Kalaftagu, but still wait Centra an hour to year, with Zuters. This can't be historical coincidence. When groups of human beings who had no contact with each other independently arrive at the same descriptions about the nature of ultimate reality and how it manifests in contemplative experience, we're dealing with something that points to an objective reality, a dimension of human experience that is universal and transcends any specific tradition. Plotinus, the 3rd century Neoplatonic philosopher who profoundly influenced both Gnostic thinkers and early Christian theologians, described what he called union with the one in experience he claimed to have had personally 4 times in his life, where all boundaries of the individual self dissolved, and what remained was a consciousness of pure light, without form, without limit, of a quality unparalleled in any ordinary worldly experience. He wrote, "Often I have woken up to myself, exiting the body, becoming external to all other things and internal to myself. I see a beauty of marvelous greatness." St. Augustine, the Christian theologian who most influenced the development of Western Catholicism and who was originally sympathetic to Manichaeism, a Gnostic tradition, before converting to Orthodox Christianity, described in his Confessions moments of intense contemplation in which the mind transcended physical senses and briefly touched something he called the unchangeable light, a light that wasn't physical, that was entirely different from any light the eyes could see, and that carried within it a quality of truth and being that no other experience came close to. What unites all these descriptions, from Sufis to Kabbalists, Neoplatonists to Christian Gnostics, Vedantists to medieval Christian mystics, is that they're all describing experiences that begin with what happens when the mind quiets, the eyes close, and attention turns inward. And they all identify the manifestations of light that emerge in this inner space, the shapes, the patterns, the pulsations, the luminous presence as the first signs of an awakening process that, when cultivated with intention and understanding, can lead to increasingly profound experiences of self-knowledge and contact with what is real. This means that you, right now, by paying attention to what happens when you close your eyes, aren't doing something esoteric, weird, or reserved for special initiates. You're doing exactly what spiritually clear human beings throughout all epochs of history have recognized as the first step on the most important path there is, the path back to yourself. To what you are, before everything that was added by conditioning, culture, fear, and forgetting. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now's the time. Hit that subscribe button below and ring the bell, because what we're exploring here is an ongoing journey, and each video is a deeper layer of this same awakening process we're discussing now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And now I want to ask you something directly. Did you already know, deep down, that the experiences you have when you close your eyes, those lights, those patterns, that presence were more than just simple neurology? That there was a deeper meaning you never had words for? Comment yes or no below. I really want to know what you're thinking and feeling right now. Because the next part of what we're going to dive into will take all of this to an even more concrete, more applicable, more transformative level for your actual life. I want you to pause for a moment, not literally stick with me here, but mentally. Because we've reached a point in the video where it's important for you to not just receive information, but to start processing what that information specifically means for you, for your life, for how you see yourself, for what you believe is possible for someone like you. Think about your spiritual history. It doesn't matter what your tradition is, what your religious background is, what degree of skepticism you carry. At some point in your life, probably more than once, you've had an experience that didn't fit the explanations available to you. A coincidence too big to be an accident. A dream that seemed to carry a message. A feeling during prayer or a moment of silence that there was something present beyond yourself. A moment when your eyes closed and what emerged in the dark wasn't nothing, but a light, a form, a presence you couldn't quite name. What did you do with that experience? Most people do one of two things. They either try to fit it into some explanatory framework they already know. It was imagination. It was fatigue. It was emotion. Or they tuck it away deep inside with a kind of silent reverence, not knowing exactly what to think, feeling it was important but lacking the tools to understand why. Neither of those responses is wrong, but neither is quite sufficient for what those experiences are trying to communicate. The Gnostic tradition offers something almost no other Western spiritual framework provides with the same clarity: a cartography, a map of inner experience. A language to describe what happens when consciousness begins to perceive layers of reality that are beyond what the five physical senses can grasp. And this cartography isn't speculative, it's based on centuries of careful observation by people who made the exploration of inner experience the center of their lives. When you close your eyes and perceive a diffused light, that's not random. When geometric patterns emerge, spirals, hexagons, shapes that seem to organize with an intelligence that isn't your conscious mind, that has a place within this cartography. When you perceive a presence that has no form but carries a quality of peace, of knowing, of love without object, that also has a name, a context, a direction that can be followed. The question isn't whether these experiences are real. The question is, what do you do with them? And here's where the reflection needs to get personal. Because Gnosis, this transformative knowledge that Jesus taught, that the Nag Hammadi texts preserved, that contemplative traditions worldwide confirm, isn't something that happens to you. It's something you actively participate in. The divine spark doesn't ignite on its own. It responds to attention. It responds to intention. It responds to the deliberate cultivation of a specific kind of inner presence that, paradoxically, isn't about doing more, but about doing less, about learning to be in silence in a way most people have never truly experienced. The German philosopher Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest Christian mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries, said something that directly resonates with the Gnostic tradition despite him being a Dominican friar operating within the Catholic Church. He said, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one vision, one knowing, one love." This isn't abstract theology. It's a description of an experience. And the word he used, knowing, is exactly the same root as gnosis. You're being invited, in this moment, to ask a question you perhaps have never asked with the full seriousness it deserves. Who are you when you're not playing any of the roles you perform in the world? When you're not your name, your profession, your relationships, your problems, your plans. Who or what remains when all of that is set aside, even for an instant? That question doesn't have an intellectual answer. It has an experiential one. And the path to that answer passes precisely through inner silence, through stillness, through the space that opens when the eyes close and attention turns inward without agenda, without haste, without expectation of finding anything specific. Because sometimes what needs to happen most isn't understanding more. It's stopping, breathing, closing your eyes, and paying attention to what's already there, waiting to be recognized. That is Gnosis. That is what Jesus called the kingdom within you. And that kingdom isn't somewhere you need to go find. It's exactly where you are right now, closer to you than your own breath. Alright, let's talk about something tangible. Because everything we've explored so far, the history of the Gnostics, the Nag Hammadi texts, the tradition of inner light, the philosophical and archaeological evidence, the deliberate suppression of this knowledge, it's all intellectually and spiritually fascinating. But knowledge that doesn't translate into real transformation in daily life, that's just sophisticated entertainment. And Gnosis was never about entertainment. It was always a practical path. So, how do you actually start working with this? The first step is both the simplest and the most radical. You need to begin taking your inner experience seriously. Sounds obvious, right? But it's not. Most people have spent their entire lives being taught to trust the opinions of others more than their own direct experiences. Institutional religion often reinforces this: there's an outside authority that interprets the sacred, and you just receive that interpretation as a finished product. Secular culture does the same thing, only instead of a religious authority, it puts the authority of materialistic rationality in its place. Gnostic practice begins with an act of radical trust in your own perception, not naively. Mind you, we're not talking about accepting just any thought or sensation as absolute truth. We're talking about creating the space for the experience to unfold, and then, with discernment, examining what that experience reveals. In practice, this means setting aside time daily for inner stillness, not to recite rote prayers, not to meditate following an app, but to simply sit, close your eyes, and observe. Observe what arises in your inner visual field. Observe the sensations in your body. Observe your thoughts without chasing them. And gradually observe what lies beneath the thoughts, the space, the consciousness, the presence that's there before any mental content even emerges. Gnostic texts suggest this process has stages. The first is what they call heightened, the ordinary state of consciousness where a person is completely identified with the material world and the ego. The second is psychico-shika, where one begins to perceive an inner dimension beyond the physical world, but is still operating primarily through beliefs and emotions. The third is pneumatikos, the state where the divine spark actively begins to awaken, where direct experience of the sacred becomes accessible, where what Jesus called the kingdom within you starts to be perceived not as metaphor, but as lived reality. The transition between these stages doesn't happen through study or accumulating information. It happens through the repeated practice of turning your attention inward. Every time you close your eyes and choose to pay attention to what arises in the stillness instead of distracting your mind with external stimuli, you're strengthening your capacity for inner perception. Every time you notice a light, a pattern, a sensation of expansion, and choose to embrace that experience instead of dismissing it, you're nurturing the spark. One specific practical step that comes directly from the contemplative tradition is what we could call the practice of inner light. Before sleep, set aside 5 to 10 minutes. Lie down, close your eyes, and instead of trying to control what appears in your inner visual field, simply observe with gentle curiosity. Don't force it. Don't expect anything specific. Just observe. If a light emerges, let it be. If a geometric pattern appears, observe it without trying to analyze it. If a sense of presence arises, welcome it without defining what it is. This simple practice, done consistently over weeks, begins to open a perception that was there all along but never received enough attention to become clear. Another practical step is what the Gnostics called anamnesi eise, remembrance. The idea that spiritual knowledge isn't something you acquire from the outside, but something you remember from within. One way to work with this is, at the end of each day, to sit in silence for a few minutes and inwardly ask, what did I recognize today? Not what I learned, not what happened, but what I recognized. What touched something that was already there? What resonated with a truth that feels older than your personal history? The Apostle Paul, in one of the letters recognized as authentically his by most biblical scholars, the first letter to the Corinthians, wrote something that resonates perfectly with this practical path. He said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." That, then, doesn't have to be a promise for after death. In the Gnostic tradition, it's a promise for when inner perception awakens sufficiently to clearly see what was always there. The mirror becomes transparent, the dim becomes luminous, and that which you have already been fully known by that greater consciousness, that primordial light, that presence at the core of every authentic contemplative experience begins to be recognized in return. You made it this far. That already tells you everything about who you are. Most people don't make it. Most click, watch 2 minutes, and bounce, because they're not ready to hear what they need to hear. You stuck around. You listened. And that's no small thing. Think about what we've journeyed through together so far. We've understood that Gnosis is a living, experiential knowledge that doesn't depend on any intermediary. We've seen that Jesus transmitted profound contemplative teachings that were deliberately removed from most people's access. We've understood that the experiences of inner light that emerge when you close your eyes are mapped in ancient spiritual traditions as the first signs of the divine spark awakening. We've reviewed the historical, philosophical, and archaeological evidence confirming this knowledge is real and that its persecution was intentional. And we've explored concrete ways to start working with this in your daily life. This video wasn't created to impress you. It was created to remind you of something you already knew. And if it did that, if at any point while you were watching, you felt that sense of recognition, that this is true, I always knew it, then it did exactly what it needed to do. If this content opened something up in you, hit that like button now. Not for me, but for the next seeker who'll stumble upon this video because of the engagement from those who are already here. That like is an act of service for someone who doesn't even know they're looking for what you just found. Subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell, because what's coming next is going to go even deeper and you won't want to miss out when that happens. And for those who made it to the very end, who were here from start to finish, listening to every word comment now, I saw W the Bola Rezavladza finds attack. Write it with I want to see in the comments who stuck around. Anyone with the courage to make it all the way to the end is exactly the kind of person ready for the next level. And check out the video popping up on screen right now. It's directly connected to everything we've just explored here, and it's going to show you the next step on this journey in a way you haven't seen anywhere else. Don't skip this one. You'll understand why.